let's turn to the next highlight of this conference and introduce Christina Bicchieri, our 6th keynote speaker. She is S.J. Patterson Harvey Professor of Social Thought and Comparative Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania. She has affiliations with a number of other departments across the humanities and social sciences. Of course, well, she's going to talk a lot about her fascinating research. I want to mention just 2 books, the more recent ones. One is The Grammar of Society, The Nature and Dynamics of Social Norms, published in 2006. And then the most recent, Norms in the Wild, How to Diagnose, Measure, and Change the Social Norm. Christina Bicchieri is an example not just of a very prolific a scholar working in a variety of areas, but of a scholar who is also making a difference and trying to have an impact, have her research have an impact in the real world. Let's just put it that way. So it's our pleasure to have you here. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, this is the result of a joint experiment, lab experiment, that I did with Eugen Demand, Simon Gachter, and Daniele Nosenzo. And the 4 of us have been really interested in the phenomenon of norm erosion. So how can a norm basically erode and disappear? And this is a phenomenon lots of people are talking about, because I hear people, some people are asking me, how is it possible that democratic norm can erode, so quickly in the present, political climate? And it is a very interesting question. And of course, in a lab experiment, you cannot do much, but you can do quite a lot. You would be surprised, about what can be done. And one thing we know is that very often, whenever there is bad behavior, people imitate it. There is a sort of attraction to bad behavior. And I found this wonderful quote from the Marquis de Sade, that certainly was a master of bad behavior. And he said, it's only by imitating the vices of others that I have earned my misfortunes. And I put the mis in parentheses because he earned his fortunes as an author, of course, also. But it's interesting that probably he wrote it when he was in jail, but the idea is that imitating vice is pretty common, unfortunately, as we shall see. Now, when we talk about social norms, what do we mean? And of course, I have my own view. And so social norms are behavioral rules that are grounded on social expectations. And the difference between social norms and other type of norms, like convention, what I call descriptive norm, is that social norm, think of a norm of reciprocity, for example, are grounded both on empirical expectation. You expect that people in your reference network behave in a particular way, do reciprocate favors, for example, but also normative expectation. Normative expectation are second-order beliefs. That is, I believe that people in my reference network believe that one should reciprocate favors. So it's a second-order belief. And this is very important, because we may obey norms even if we don't like them. It's not necessary that I think, reciprocity is important in order for me to reciprocate, to obey a reciprocity norm. Of course, I must have a conditional preference for obey the norm, conditional on having certain expectations. Now, this is very different from, let me see if I can illuminate anything. No. From descriptive norms, like think of a signaling system. I don't know if you ever saw movies or documentaries of, a trade pit. And in a trade pit, you see people signaling, the traders signal, when they want to buy or sell. And it is a well-defined and understood signaling system. And that system is supported, of course, by empirical expectation. I expect everybody else to use those signals, but there is no normative expectation there. If I don't use the signal, that's my problem. So it is perfectly rational, for me as a trader to use the signaling system, but other people really don't care if I use it or not. With social norms instead, it is very important. There is a collective preference for people basically obeying the norm, obeying the rule. Now, social norms have been studied quite a bit in the experimental literature, and they are obviously seen as very important for both pro-social but also antisocial behavior. So there are situations where people, and this we have seen actually, we did a study in Nigeria about corruption, and there is a lot of police corruption. And the norm is to be corrupt. And if you're not corrupt, you will be punished. Okay, so there can be a lot of antisocial behavior that are normative in certain groups. And there have been also experiments about that, very interesting, in which people punish, the person that doesn't obey the sort of bad, negative norms that the group supports. Now, the influence of peers is another thing that we know matters a lot. We know when I obey a norm is a property of network, is a property of groups, not so much of individuals. So to identify the reference group, to know that there is a reference group is very important. And therefore, when I talk of peer influence, I talk of a reference group that somebody has in the moment in which he or she decides to obey the norm. We also know that the response to the behavior that people observe is asymmetrical. What do I mean by asymmetrical? There are lots of experiments about that there is a very strong response to observing violations of a norm. Okay? So antisocial behavior is highly contagious. Okay? When people observe other people behaving badly, there will be quite a bit of imitation. And we know that often bad norms persist exactly because people keep imitating, the reference network, in which the bad norm, is common. And we also know that there is an acceleration of negative behavior, of antisocial behavior, through being observed and observing peers that behave badly. And Dan Ariely, has, this hypothesis that looking and observing bad behavior diminishes a person's psychological cost of behaving badly. And actually, we know one thing that, is quite well established, then sending people information about bad behavior normalizes it. So when in college, if you start telling students that a majority of students cheat, they will normalize it. Most people do it, fine, I can do it. And Ariely claims that this also, I think it just normalizes a situation. Ariely claims that this basically reduces the psychological cost of behaving badly. And we also know that the response to norm compliance is weaker than the response generally to norm following, okay? And we also know there are some studies that group cohesion facilitates norm degeneration. That's an interesting thing that we wanted to check, actually. Now, most of the research done in the lab doesn't look at a dynamic system. They look at one-shot situation in which either people comply with the norm or people violate a norm, end of story. And what we ask is, okay, let's look at peer exposure that goes on over time, is dynamic, okay? So what happens through time, and is obviously more realistic because we don't look at people just once and then they die. We look at people repeatedly. We observe people repeatedly. And if people, we know, respond more to violation than to compliance, is it inevitable? Are there mechanisms that may block these really vicious dynamics? And what we came out, and you should be interested here because I hear people are interested about in-group, out-group behavior. What if we create social proximity? Now, in social psychology, there's been a lot of work starting with Muzaffer Sharif and then Tashfel and Turner about in-group behavior. Typically, they do experiment in which there is an in-group and there is an out-group. But the interesting thing that Tashfel did is the minimal group paradigm, in which basically you divide people in two groups artificially, the red and the whites. The people who prefer Clay to Kandinsky and people who prefer Kandinsky to Clay. And then they do experiment in which, strange enough, people really, suppose I am in a Clay preferring group, I will favor, my group member. I don't see them, it's completely anonymous. I only know that, like me, they prefer Clay. Okay? I will favor them against the Kandinsky guys, the Kandinsky preferer. So there are all these minimal group paradigm effect. And another thing that I found very interesting, in all these experiments, they show that a minimal, ridiculous, if you will, similarity, so you're similar to me because we both like Clay. If you then ask people to imagine, are there other dimensions in which you would be similar to these people? Yes, there are. So they imagine that they are more similar even in political affiliation to people they don't know, are completely anonymous, but are part of their group. Okay? So there is a lot of in-group effect, basically motivated by nothing. Okay? So we ask, maybe creating social proximity, so creating an in-group, will change behavior. And we know it does, these are economists who analyze that, but much before economists, social psychologists have shown that very clearly. And we know that, in-group behavior also predicts the evolution of altruistic behavior and cooperation. So there are good things, but also bad things about social proximity. Now, what we did, what sort of experiment we did. Designing an experiment is everything, and you have to be very clear about the concept you use. So what we did, we had a donation game. So you play with a charity, and the charity is completely passive, okay? And I give you $10, and I give the charity $10. And expressed in point, you have 100 points and the charity has 100 points. And you have to decide in each round of the game, each round you get 10 and 10, what to do. You can take from the charity, you can leave the situation as is, equality basically, or you can give to the charity, okay? And you're free to do is basically, you can do whatever you want. Is not a strategic game, okay? And at the end, I tell you that one decision maker will be chosen randomly, and one of his or her choices will be chosen, and this person, like he or she, will be paid, and the charity will be paid accordingly. Okay, and we repeat the game for 20 rounds. And what we vary is the knowledge about the action of peers that are part of my group. I show you now what I mean. So pre-experiment, we incentivize a social proximity question. And we went over many different ideas of social proximity. This is interesting because it's a little bit more than the minimal group paradigm, but it's still very tenuous. And the question is, tell me the year the Phillies won the last World Series. Of course, we're doing the experiment in Philadelphia, so people, should know. And I don't. I don't care about baseball, but anyway, people usually know. And, so we divide people into groups, those who know, who respond correctly, and those who respond incorrectly, okay? And so you know which group you are, and if you are in a group of people, you know if people in this group responded correctly or incorrectly, and similar or dissimilar to you. Then there is a first round of individual decision in which I have $10, the charity has $10, I decide what to do. I have no information about other people, nothing, just the initial round, okay? I can give, take, or do nothing. And then we have 19 rounds, okay? And we have either group of 2 people or group of 4 people, and I can tell you in advance there is no difference between 2 and 4. We expected some difference, there isn't. And there is random allocation, you are not rematched, so for all the other 19 rounds, you are matched with the same people. You don't see these people, you don't know who they are. But in first and second treatment, in treatment 1, there is a screen, and on the screen, for each other player, whom you don't know, is like player 2, 3, and 4, there is the history of what the player did. So you know how they behaved. In the treatment 2, there is not only history, but I also give you information about their social proximity, how they answer the initial question, okay? And in the baseline is completely anonymous. Yeah, I make my decision, I don't know, I don't observe, I don't know what other people did. Nothing, and then there is a usual post-experiment questionnaire. We measure risk propensity, etc. It's not very interesting. Okay, what's happening? Why is not working? That, okay, sorry. Now, these are the number, of people we have. We have hundreds of people. And first of all, when we talk of norms, we have to establish that a norm exists. A lot of economists think they are doing experiments with norms, but does a norm exist? Who knows? And so what I want is usually an independent assessment of empirical and normative expectation. Let's see if people in general think that there is a norm, in this case a norm of giving. And so what we did, we asked 108 third parties online, incentivized question, and I show you what happens. This is the first question. What do you think most people in the experiment did? Okay, we explain the experiment, it's well described. And, most think that either they did nothing or they gave, okay? And then we ask them their personal normative beliefs. So what do you think one should do? And look at the majority said, they should give something. Okay, give something to charity. You don't take, of course, take is really bad, and doing nothing is like 30% say doing nothing, but more than 50% say, you should, give something. And then I ask the crucial normative expectation question, which is, guess the correct statement, and I pay you for correctness. The majority of participants in the survey said that one should take money, don't do anything, give money. And again, more than 50% think that one should give money to a charity. That particular case, they know the game. So our conclusion is that there seems to be a norm of giving, okay? That people think that is not only appropriate, that one should give, to the charity in this situation. So our first hypothesis is when exposed to peers, so we have established there is some norm we can talk about. So when exposed to peer, individuals react much more to example of violation than compliance. But this is the problem. Over time, the norm will erode. A norm of giving will exist no longer. Okay? So with observation, basically, there will be erosion of norm compared to a situation where you observe nobody. And I show you then what it means. Now, when we introduce observation plus social proximity, our hypothesis is that the reaction to peer exposure will be amplified. You will, as always, respond to bad behavior, but you will also respond to good behavior. And this, in some sense, will, change the negative dynamics, will mute it a little bit, okay? So the erosion will be reduced. And in fact, in the end, we want to claim that exposure to in-group, creating in-groups, may be a very good medicine, against norm erosion. We know that individuals look for excuses to be selfish, and if there is a signal that other people behave badly or are selfish, they will embrace it, okay? And so our third hypothesis is when facing norm violation by peers, who will change more behavior? The good guys, because now they have an excuse. The bad guys don't need to change behavior. Those that, basically leave things as they are don't need that much to change behavior, but the good guys change behavior. Okay, let's look at the result. This is initially, I say no information observation SP, but it doesn't matter because in the first iteration, nobody observed anything, nobody knows anything. So basically, there is quite a number of antisocial people. Okay, at the beginning, quite a few people behave antisocially, quite a few people don't do anything, and pro-social people are really a small minority, unfortunately. This is just the initial result, first move. Now look at what happens. What happens to the change in charity box over time? Now look at the line of no information. If people don't observe good, bad behavior, there is a decay in good behavior, but it's not terrible. When people simply observe other people, the terrible line goes down, it goes down systematically. So bad behavior wins the day, okay? Instead, when there is observation plus social proximity, which is the intermediate line, is much more similar to the simple no observation case. There is a moderation of the bad effect. And you see that here, the average change in the charity box with observation is huge and is statistically significant. It's very, very important, okay? So this is average, okay? I'm not saying different types behave different. This is an average, okay? But it's significant, and this decline is precipitous, I would say. Now, if we look at what happens, these are, oh, thank you so much. Okay, thank you. Here, if you look when in T-1 there was negative donation, means somebody took from the charity, it has both observation and observation social proximity diminish their generosity, let's say. They take more. The problem is, the interesting thing is down here. How do I go down here? Like this? Okay. Down here, what happens is if there was a positive average donation in the previous time, so if people were generous, you see that observation has no effect. People who just observe, zero effect. The people with social proximity is a huge effect. So look at the, negative, they both respond. These people respond more, actually. But positive, only the social proximity respond. The others don't respond at all. And if you look at the average zero, average donation, there is really no difference. And if we look simply at, with respect to the base level no information, observation has a huge negative effect. So observing other people, now remember, I gave you some numbers before how many people start behaving badly. It's like 47%. So the chance of observing bad behavior is pretty high. Okay. Now, how often people switch type, okay, from generous to bad, and maybe the other way around, not necessarily. And what we think, with information, the majority does not switch type. With the observation, we have a significant number of people who switch type, and observation SP is more moderate, okay? Is not strongly significant, is more moderate. Now, I want to look at conditional types. That is, people who started with equal split, givers versus taker. Takers, as I said before, don't care. Observation, social proximity, they are bad guys. They don't give a damn. The equal split, is certainly observation goes up, is significant, but is not gigantic with respect to no information and social proximity. Here, the givers change a lot. This is an interesting result. That the givers, with respect to no information and social proximity, for observation, almost 50% change. They are no longer givers. They are takers. They become takers. So it's very, very interesting. This effect is really huge here. Okay? Now, here we did something funny. We look at the density, okay? And where they started and where they move. So these are the initial takers, okay? The bad guys who start taking. And if there is no information, so the blue is the initial decision and the red is where they end, basically. And it's sort of, there isn't on average that much difference, The people who take, move maybe a little bit in this direction, but it's not a gigantic thing. With observation, they become really bad. Okay, look here, the density gets really very, very high, so they move massively, towards even worse behavior. And look at this, social proximity sort of changes things and makes it very similar to the no information. So social proximity, even with the bad guys, has a positive, you can say positive, but a less negative effect than observation. With equal split, again, initial they stay here, and in the end, with the observation and social proximity is very similar to the beginning. So, but instead, when there is simple observation, there is much more spread, and they move towards bad behavior, towards taking. Now, what happens to this is the most interesting, the initial good guys, okay? So if there is no observation, no information about other people, they don't move that much. They move a little bit, but not that much. They stay pretty good. Look what happens if they observe bad behavior. They move significant towards taking. So they abandon the initial generosity, okay, and they follow the vices of other people. Significant. This is the most significant and interesting. When instead there is social proximity, it's very interesting. This effect is muted. So we would say that social proximity, again, helps, okay? Now, if we look at another interesting question. I wanted to know how much a group is cohesive, okay? Especially in a group of 4 people, okay? Are they all, people who gave the right answer about the Phillies? Or there is a mixture of people? When a group is highly cohesive, so either they all don't know about the Phillies or they all know, what happens here is that they have a very interesting response. Now I don't know which one is. Well, they respond both to negative donation and to, but also to positive donation. So the more cohesiveness, in the sense I'm really socially proximate to the guys, that I observe, in inverted commas, okay, that I have, there is an effect of the negative, but also of the positive. Not cohesive group, the negative has an effect, but there is no effect on the positive. When the group is not cohesive, we go basically to the same result that we have with simple observation. So observation and social proximity is really interesting because, yes, people react to bad examples, always, but they also react to good examples. And they don't in the simple observation. So social proximity does something very interesting, okay? Sorry. And we look here at behavioral contagion. So it gives you an idea of what they did initially and how they change behavior, okay? And look, for example, at the initial takers, the initial bad guys, okay? Over time, they may get, with no information, they may get a little better, but not much, actually. With observation and social proximity, they get better, they get a little better. And with observation, they stay basically bad. Now, the interesting thing is, look at the initial givers. With, no information, they tend to decline, but not that much. Over 20 rounds, they may, take or not give. But look what happens when they observe other people. Is a gigantic effect. So these initial good guys, okay, there is an incredible amount of behavioral contagion. They start behaving really badly. And these are the people I am interested in, because I'm interested in people who start behaving nicely and what happens to them. This is the idea of norm erosion, because people who behave badly, they don't care about the norm, they couldn't give a damn, and we don't care about them. But these are the people we care about, and they are tremendously influenced by observing negative behavior. And we know there is a lot of negative behavior because we know initially like 45 or 47% behave badly. Now, look at these guys, the Greek guys. What happens when there is social proximity? They fall prey to bad behavior, but not as much. Social proximity helps enormously, even when they observe bad behavior, okay? And my question is, why, okay? Why this in-group formation mitigates norm erosion, mitigates the bad apple example? This is an interesting question that we want to ask. Now, look at this is the change in average change, charity box over time, when the majority is initially antisocial and when it's pro-social. The majority pro-social are people who give at the beginning, and look what happens with simple observation. Really bad, okay? And if they are antisocial, the influence is less big because they were bad to start with, so nothing happens. While these people were very good to start with, and so they basically are highly influenced by the fact that people behave badly. And look at this. This is what happens with the social proximity plus observation. It's very interesting. Social proximity basically creates, sort of mutes the bad, the bad effect of the bad example. And this is very interesting. So let's look at our hypotheses. Do they pan out? The first is when exposed to peer, people react more strongly to norm violation than norm compliance, and this leads to an erosion of the norm. Yes, this does, okay? The second is social proximity amplifies the behavioral reaction to peer exposure. And what happens is people that are in observation and social proximity respond to both norm violation and norm compliance, both, which is very interesting because the erosion of the good norm is less dramatic in this case. It's a very interesting result. And the third, we have seen that when people face norm violation by peers, the percentage change in behavior towards norm violation is much greater for the initially good guys than for the other guys. The bad guys stay bad. The equal split change, but not that dramatically. But those that change most is, the non-followers, the good guys. The good guys are really, these poor guys are really influenced in a terrible way, by, bad examples. So what's the conclusion? That peer effects, what do I mean by peer effects is simple observation, okay, of other people in the particular experiment, that behave, let's say, badly, leads to norm erosion in this setting, which is dynamic because we have 20 repetition, okay? So you say antisocial behavior is much more contagion, we know from lots of other experiments, than prosocial behavior. Now, erosion is reduced when we create social proximity. This is very interesting, okay? So people copy, yes, antisocial, but also prosocial. And this works even to the signal, what do you know about the Phillies World Cup is really a tenuous signal. It's not a strong signal about proximity. It's sort of less than minimal, but quite minimal, quite small, if you will, proximity. And these almost cancel out the effect, the terrible effect, the negative effect of observation. But the group has to be cohesive, okay? People must feel, but see that they are in a group of people similar to them, okay? So they are all bad predictors of the Phillies. It means we don't like sports, maybe all of us don't like baseball, or they are good, we all like baseball. And as I told you, we have a lot of evidence from social psychology that people tend to assume from a very tenuous similarity many more non-tenuous important similarities. So this may be an interesting effect here. So what are the implications for policy? Very often policy intervention broadcast information. We give people information about what other people do, etc. And if we give information about anonymous others, any other people, these typically also, the kind of information is negative, like typical information is telling people how many people don't pay taxes. It's a disaster because this normalizes not paying taxes and people feel entitled, to behave like most of the population. And the same, they asked me at the University of Pennsylvania what I thought about certain moralizing campaigns against cheating. And I say, If you give a moral message, what is the inference that people draw? The most people cheat. You should not cheat. Why do you tell me? Because people cheat, okay? And so both moralizing messages and information about, statistical information about a significant percentage of people, let's say, cheating, is very bad. It sort of induces cheating more than preventing it, okay? So it's very important to realize that the message you send is crucial, can do a lot of damage. But the second thing, which I think is the most interesting, is creating social proximity. And creating social proximity may have very, very good effect. In this case, it has a mitigating effect, okay? I think that in cases in which there is the risk of norm erosion, creating social proximity may lead to good results, but we have, to prove that, and I don't have any proof but this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. A methodological question that experimentalists normally get asked in economics, which is the metagame. So did you ask at the very end, so people get their own money at the end of the game, regardless of how much they give to charity. Do they actually give to charity afterwards? Do you have at the very end of the game a screen that says,
no,
now that you have your own money, please?
Thank you for the question. What we did to avoid any problems is at the end of the game, only one is randomly chosen, okay, to get all the money he or she wanted, or the money he get to the charity, etc. However, everybody else will get $10, then $10 to the charity. So at the end of the game, but of course, if you behave badly and you are the only one chosen, you get $20 because, you basically cheated the charity, you took money from the charity. But no, at the end, everyone, the charity gets, we pay a charity, okay? We chose, okay, at the beginning, we tell people that they will be able to choose a charity, but we don't tell which charity because we don't want to create effects, social proximity, oh, these other people choose the charity that I hate. So there is UNICEF, Doctor Without Border, and Wildlife Fund. And people at the end, the person who's chosen will be randomly chosen, will be able to choose the charity. And then, we give 10 and 10 to everyone, okay?
Thank you very much. It's a really interesting talk. My name is Anna Molchanova. So when my daughter was in middle school, they had this so-called MOST campaign. I don't know what research they went by, but they put pictures of middle schoolers with huge letters. Most middle schoolers of this school don't drink beer. And they would say 8% had beer in the last year, and like 92 didn't. So yeah. My question is, like, what is exactly a socially proximate individual? By putting pictures of those middle schoolers whom they knew, did they create this social proximate pool, or was it just peers? So, because I was very worried about this, because if you know that 8% of sixth graders, consumed beer, then you're just going to try, right? But so my question. My question was to you is like, did they create the socially proximate group by putting pictures on, or was it actually bad effect through peer effect?
It's very interesting because they were copying a study done in Princeton. And so parents in Princeton were very worried that their kids drank a lot, college kids. And so they asked social psychologists, what can we do? And the social psychologist at Princeton had an idea. They said, well, first of all, you're telling students that many students drink, and this is very bad. And let's ask students privately whether they like to drink so much or not, whether they feel pressure to drink or not, and what they really like. And the result, is something they call pluralistic ignorance. The result is that most students express privately a negative attitude towards drinking, but they felt compelled. When I am with my peer, we're at the bar, I believe, I am the only deviant that doesn't like drinking, the other people really like it, and therefore I will drink. Okay, and so they decided to give around information about this survey showing that a sort of majority of students didn't really like the amount. It was more the amount of drinking, more that drinking or not drinking, but the amount of drinking. These kids get drunk and all sorts of bad things happen. So that basically probably was, and lots of stuff had been published in social psychology about that research. So probably they were thinking, so the children were sixth graders, okay? So they were thinking, they were basically doing the same. They wanted to tell kids that, their peers, don't drink, etc. It would have been more effective if they did what they did in Princeton, so asking kids, personally, how do you feel about that, and then exposing that more than drink or not drink. Because I tell you, it may be the case that a lot of kids drink. And so if you tell me they don't drink, I don't trust you, okay? So you are not telling me about the statistic about how much they drink. You tell me how much they like or they feel pressured about drinking. That's a different story. So they made a mistake, okay? Because if kids know that other kids drink, telling them 8%, they laugh, saying, no. And also they have to trust the source.
Thanks for the fascinating research. It occurred to me that the information to which subjects had access in both the observation conditions in your study was somewhat more minimal than the relevant information to which we have access in real-world cases of norm following. And in particular, what's missing, it seems to me, is access to others' appraisals of your own behavior, explicit verbal appraisals, or even punishment and reward for norm following or failing to follow norms. Because in the social world, it's not as though we merely observe what others are doing. That might be relevant to a norm. But others tell us whether they like us following norms. Sometimes we kill people for failing to follow norms in some states,
Sure.
and sometimes we reward them greatly. So I wonder how you think having access to punishment and reward or appraisals might change the
These
dynamics.
are very important in norm following, of course. But what we want to do, when you do an experiment, you want to be minimal. You want to isolate something, If I want to do an experiment with punishment, and there are lots of experiments with punishment, and actually I did lots of experiments about punishment versus compensation, and people, actually that's an interesting result, it's published, people prefer to compensate victims instead of punishing the perpetrators. So there is a strong push toward compensating the victim and not so much punishing. And I have my hypothesis about that. So, but here, in real life, people do a lot of things. The important question here is, let's isolate observation of good and bad behavior. And let's see the effect of simple observation. You cannot punish. This is not a strategic game. Because in real life, what happens is I'm punished or whatever because what I do create a negative externality for you, for the community. Here there is no negative externality. you know, is a charity. Who cares about the charity? The charity gets money, the charity gets taken money away. It's not strategic. I want to eliminate interdependence. Exactly what you talk about are interdependence. I want to eliminate them. And so in a simple story without interdependence, what happens? Okay? What happens when they observe other people, you know, doing something that has no effects whatsoever on them? Well, a pretty bad effect. And what happens if I introduce social proximity? It's muted. This is the interesting thing. Okay, punishment, reward, etc. is I punish or reward if it touches me or it touches my community, etc. This is completely non-strategic.
Hey, my name is Jim Swindler. I have a question about what's going on the public highways. Lots of people.
Where is it?
Right here.
Oh,
Sorry.
hi.
Lots of people, it seems to me, break the speed limits regularly, right? And many seem to believe that they need to keep up with the flow of traffic. They think it's safer, right? The official position is otherwise, of course. But so what I'm wondering is this: you know, this is a case, I think, of social proximity. They can see what the other drivers are doing. They're right there next to them, and so on. And so I wonder if this is a case where the social proximity actually makes the behavior worse. It makes them deviate from the real norm more.
I wouldn't talk of social proximity in this case, unless you think that you could define social proximity as we are all on the highway. Okay? In this case, I think it's simple observation. You observe your peers, other drivers, driving very fast. What I, for example, would infer, looking at people driving very fast, is that there is no police around. That would be my inference, and therefore I can drive fast. That would be my personal inference, but I am Italian. So maybe it's completely, you know, an Italian assumption. But this is what I would infer. So I observe that behavior, and, you know, I like to, let's say, to go faster. I arrive earlier. But my inference is there is no punishment here because so many people are doing it. That would be my inference. But, okay.
Thanks very much. Just, I'd like to interrogate a little bit the extent to which we can be confident that what we've really got in play here is a norm. And so a lot of the issues have to do with how you incentivized the group who identified the existence of a norm. There's sort of two dimensions to the worry. So one is, I mean, if we think subjects are bringing into the lab their experience of norms in the world, it is, after all, not really arguably not a norm in the world that I give all my endowment to charity, right? It's a sort of norm in the world that when I get some money, I give some of it to charity and keep some. Yeah. And that then is a problem when we've got a dynamic effect, right? If I've already given in the first round, well, I've done my duty now, right? So now it's my turn. And so when in our lab, when we're trying to look at norms, we always take one treatment group and give them an incentivized belief task where we test for their confidence that other people will behave in accordance with the norm, right? And pay them using a quadratic scoring rule so that it's incentive compatible. And then we also make sure that treatment group themselves then go through the exercise, because that way we also can see whether their expectation of a norm is consistent with their own behavior. But as far as I could, you went quite quickly through how you, I'm not sure you said how you incentivized the external group who identified the existence of the norm.
Yeah, thank you. There are many different issues in your question. Let's start about incentivizing. So, first of all, I don't ask the same people in the experiment. Why? Because I influence them, and I don't want to influence people. You know, if I make people think, oh, what's the right thing to do, etc., they would be influenced, so I don't ask them. I ask third parties, okay? I ask third parties, and I incentivize two questions. The first is about empirical expectation. I describe to them the game, and I tell them, you know, how do you think the majority behaved, okay? If you're right, I give you money. So, you know, it's not projection, I want the money, so I'm thinking, you know, I'm trying to be accurate. Then I ask them their personal normative beliefs, which obviously is not incentive, what do you think is, you know, one should do. But then they ask the normative expectation, second order belief, which I incentivize. If you answer correctly, you get, you know, some money. So there is incentivization there. So doing this independent assessment tells me that, you know, people normally think that giving to charity is, you know, what one should do, even giving very little. Answering then your question about, oh, but I already gave once, every round you go back to having $10. We did that, otherwise you're perfectly right when you say, okay, I gave, bye-bye. No, at each round, 10-10. So at each round, you can give $1. You know, okay.
Hi, I'm Eduardo over here.
Hi.
Thanks, this is really interesting. So I wanted to ask about, I guess, if you had any more information about external validity, so any real-world cases that might have exhibited this kind of norm erosion or mitigating effect. In particular, I'm interested in the intervention you suggested of simple proximity being a mitigating factor. Because as you mentioned, with these kind of minimal group cases, people are going to be assuming all kinds of other similarity, which won't be present, especially in these kind of you know, very minimal types of identities in the real world. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts from these, if there's any external cases where what kinds of proximity or what kinds of identities are better at mitigating versus others.
Okay, thank you. We know, okay, from lots of experiments in social psychology, and if I were to ask these people, probably would confirm that a minimum similarity makes people infer lots of other similarities that are completely unwarranted. We know that. But think if you are, as I said at the beginning, in a group, you know that there are people who like clay and people who like Kandinsky, and you are one who likes clay. You think, and you think to like better somebody who's like you and likes clay. It's natural. We do that. Other is very spontaneous. If you start thinking, you may say, come on, am I stupid? Why do I have to think that? But people naturally, and we are people, we do that all the time, seem to think that there are, more similarities lurking behind, the liking clay, that we both like clay. And in this case, it may be exactly the case. We don't know because we didn't check that. But if we look at social psychology, that there are tons of, over the years of experiments, this is something quite well established. And so how would you create similarities? There are many ways to do that, then unfortunately, what is happening now is that the similarity are created towards an outgroup. The immigrant. In Italy, there is this big thing that I follow about immigrants. It's very racist. And people are responding in a very stupid way. It's us versus them. Politicians know that very well. They know that when you create an in-group identity against an out-group, is a winning move. What I'm proposing here is not just to create an in-group, out-group, but simply an in-group, okay? We're here all together doing something. And if you start creating in-group, out-group, it can be potentially very, very negative, okay?
Thank you very much. A great talk. My name is Michael Schmitz. So I was wondering, when norms are deteriorating in a group, a possible response could also be to leave the group if you have a chance, or maybe not even to join the group. Or if it's a group where you don't have that option, or it's very hard, or you strongly identify the group, you might try to take action to counteract this deterioration. Yet to take a completely hypothetical example, suppose the group has elected a bad leader, like a bad president, and then you might feel that you need to, because you so strongly identify with the group, you need to do something to stop this deterioration of norms. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on these kinds of phenomena, or know of any research, your own or other people's.
What's happening now, you mean? I think, to be honest, and I look at Trump and I look at examples in Italy, I think there are a lot of people that think like him and didn't have the courage to be racist, okay, to exclude other people, and now they have the courage. Oh, our leader does that. So it encourages people to express feeling that they already had. So it's not that he's teaching us something new. I think these are feelings, very politically incorrect, but many people are. Let's face it, okay? And this is the problem. You know, it's not that he's teaching new bad skills to people. You know, he's showing them that they have permission to be bad. This is the important issue. So the people haven't really changed that much. There are a group of people that did not change much. This is the problem. Yes, sure. But there is a lot of discussion now about, you know, the demise of certain democratic norms, et cetera. And I think norms are more fragile than we think, okay? Especially because we live in our bubble and you know, political correctness, et cetera, and we think our norms are very strong. They're very strong in our group. They may not be strong at all in the population at large. So we have to open our eyes and see what's happening, okay? Hey.
Hi, I'm Rohit from New York, and I know you've been to India many times. I don't know if you go to Indian movies, but suppose you are in India and you're watching a performance of Casablanca. At some stage, Humphrey Bogart lights up a cigarette. Immediately a sign comes on, smoking causes cancer. As soon as he puts out the cigarette, the sign goes away. So there is no sign throughout the movie. It just appears every time he lights up a cigarette. So it could be that pointing to norm violation as norm violation may ameliorate some of these effects of norm deterioration. That if every time somebody does something, right? If you are in a bus in Switzerland and you start talking in a loud voice, people immediately say,
right. The problem is, as I said before, it may be the case that for many people, certain norms of tolerance are not norms at all. This is the important thing to realize. And speaking of, no, I don't watch Indian movies because I don't speak Hindi. So it would be... Touché. But basically, it's very interesting what you say that Humphrey Bogart smoked, and Humphrey Bogart is a great actor, and people want maybe to imitate him, and they have the counter message. But I don't know if you remember at a certain point in England, they put these death packs of cigarette with a skull, etc., you die. People bought them, they don't care. Okay, so I don't think it will have an effect, really.
Hi, I'm Robin. I just have a quick question for see if you gathered this information, but I was wondering if you gathered demographic information about your participants,
of course.
And if so, whether these effects were impervious to difference across race, gender, class, and those other kinds of...
Actually, we had a majority of women. Unexpectedly, there was a majority of women, but we always look in every experiment. You look at men versus women, asking if there are gender differences. This is a very important question. And when we do, this is a lab experiment, okay? When you do MTurk, you have to pay a lot of attention, demography, because, for example, if I do this experiment with Americans, I want to be sure that people who respond on MTurk are Americans. And at the very beginning of MTurk, there were lots of people from all sorts of nations, China, India, whatever, that were responding. And clearly the responses would be culturally quite different. So you try to manage that. Another thing that we discovered very recently, which is terrible, is that there are groups that basically fake, okay, get a lot of money because we pay people on MTurk. And so basically this group send around tons of answers, okay, to all sorts of experiments, but they are fake. And so they make money with that. And so now we are implementing ways, okay, to eliminate that. But this is very, very relevant and very important. Okay? So there are a lot of things that are being done to prevent cheating on MTurk. And the first thing that was done, which was not cheating, basically, is creating a demographic, a demographically similar population. Yeah, this is always done.
I was just wondering if in the lab context,
yeah,
if the effects were different across gender, race.
No. But we control for that, always.
Hi, I'm Bill. So the upshot of this seems to be that norms are very fragile. It's easy to get them. It's relatively easy to get them to go away. And while we've got some things that ameliorate this, none of these things actually strengthen norms. We can just make them. We can just make the deterioration less bad. It's one thing that makes you wonder about is, well, if it's so easy for norms to deteriorate, how do you get them established in the first place? Because it looks as though, that there's enough pressure against them that becomes really paradoxical. Now, one thing people often talk about in this context is punishment, but it looks as though punishing is also going to be a norm. And so a worry is, that seems like it might be circular. So I guess I'm wondering sort of what the other side of the story is.
Thank you. That's a great question, and it's similar to the question that was asked before. In this case, we take, a norm where there are no interdependencies, so there is no punishment involved, nothing. With many norms, there is punishment. There are sanctions involved, typically negative sanctions, okay? And especially when a norm is created, you want to create normative expectations. Normative expectations are created by negative sanctions, basically. And in the work I do a lot of applied work. We looked at communities in Africa, India, village communities that decide to stop and open defecation and build latrine and use them. And the community usually decides once they realize that this creates a very negative effect for everybody. Okay, they realize that eventually. And so they decide collectively to change behavior, and immediately, and these are, village people, they immediately enact sanctions, monitoring and sanctions against the people who violate the new behavioral rules. So in certain African villages, they send around children with whistles, and they go around and look if somebody defecates in the open, and they start whistling. Or in another community, older people with sticks went around beating. And it's very interesting about punishment, because since this sanction was collectively agreed upon, the punisher will feel entitled to punish. If it's not agreed upon, there is a problem, because punishment invites retaliation. So there must be a sense in a community that we all agree that this is the behavior that, should be performed, and therefore punishment, for transgression is legitimate and empowers me to punish. But if there is no agreement, people won't punish. This is very, very important. It's a very good question.
Thank you. I would like to ask you about interpretation of the facts. Actually, maybe I didn't understand the experiment right, but first round, I give money, the bad guy takes money. So second round, I know that he took money and I gave money, so I understand that he took my money. Second,
No, excuse me, can you repeat?
Yes.
I'm confused.
Yes.
So at the beginning, what happens? So I have $10 and the charity has $10. Yeah. And I can give some of this money to the charity doing nothing, or take some money from the charity. And the next time, same story.
The sum of the charity depends on the sum of the two players, of the participants putting money in it.
Okay. What I know from observation, okay, there is a screen that tells me what each participant did with a charity. I don't know if it's my charity.
Oh,
okay?
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
These are two separate things. So yes, you're right. It may be that, so many people donated. No, I want to just look at behavior independent of what I did. That's crucial.
Yes.
Because otherwise, I may start thinking, they got so much money.
Exactly. That was my question.
No.
Okay.
This doesn't happen.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello. Hi. I'm here. My name's Yannick. I was wondering if you thought that the dynamics would be the same if the norm was negative, which I would probably even argue that most norms are in the kinds of societies that we have. And so, yeah, I wonder how much this is linked to, it being a supposedly good norm and that bad behavior, whether the dynamics would be the same if the norm was negative, like, I don't know, do you have an example of a negative norm?
You can think of negative norms when there are interdependencies. Like, people are corrupt, and if I am the only good guy, you will punish me. Okay, this happens, even experimentally. Thinking in this case of a negative norm, so it would be a norm of, never giving to charities, but this is not something that people feel. So what would be the negative norm? Gender? Gender. Oh, dress. Okay. Is gender dress considered a negative norm? How? So if people don't dress according to their gender, is negative, okay? But the norm is to dress according to gender. Well, what we ask is an independent assessment, okay, of what people think, people should do and most people think should do. Period. Okay? In this case, is positive. Okay?
So the effect on society generally is not
Well, there could be negative norms, but all the negative norms I can think about are really interdependent. They are, you get praised for doing something maybe that we consider bad or punished. So there is a lot of interdependence. Here I wanted to eliminate complete interdependence and look simply, People feel that this is good, that this should be done. And then I am in an environment in which I observe people violating the norm. What happens? Okay? There is no interdependence, no punishment, nothing. It's just observation. And observation has terribly negative consequences. Okay? Now, the interesting thing here is that these consequences can be mitigated by social proximity. This is the interesting thing. And the question to me that nobody is asking actually is why social proximity? This is the question to ask. Why social proximity? And to tell you the truth, I don't have an answer. Okay? Why? What's happening with social proximity that is minimal? Because, the Phillies World Series, who cares? Okay? Has an effect. Why? With social proximity, of course we pay attention to bad examples, but also to good ones. Why? And without social proximity, only bad examples matter. So is there something in this feeling, I am part of a group and cohesion matters a lot, that makes me focus also on the good behavior? This is the interesting question, I think, that we should ask. What's there that makes me focus also on the good? I focus on the bad too, as everybody does. But the mitigating effect is also focus on the good, and you saw the statistics is very interesting. Why? Again, I don't have an answer. I know that social proximity has lots of effects, but nobody studied this mitigating effect, which I think is very interesting. Oh.
Hi. I think I'm following up on a couple of other things that have been said, and one of the things that struck me very much is when you said, this basically message that norms are so fragile, and the work that I come from and the kind of world that I come from, it is not. I mean, I work on mostly feminist philosophy and gender. I mean, this gender norms are so incredibly difficult to break, even by people who are professional feminists who constantly sort of fall into the traps of various kinds of gendered behaviors and norms. And now I'm starting to think that, well, are we really? I mean, okay, maybe there are just maybe there are different notions of norms that we can appeal to, which is fine by me. But at the same time, when I'm now thinking about kind of other kinds of norms, like say the sort of gendered norms. And thinking about the idea of whether there's a norm that giving to charity is good, I'm no longer convinced that that's a norm. I mean, I think that's a normative judgment. So people make judgments like, ought to want to give charity, and people say like, yes. So there might be something like, maybe we call it, maybe you want to call it, maybe it's a moral norm or something like that. But that's a very different kind of thing from something like behavioral norms. And maybe there are certain kinds of moral norms that are then very easy to break, and they're very fragile. But that's because they're on the level of, I don't know, judgments or kind of convictions or something like that, or commitments. Maybe that just tells us that sort of our sort of commitments to certain causes or to morally good behavior or something like that. That's very fragile. But actually, behavior that is in accordance with certain kinds of social norms is incredibly difficult to break, and actually not fragile at all in the way that you were talking about.
I sort of agree with you, sort of, okay? Because first of all, there is very little written and studied about how to measure the fragility or strength of a norm, okay? There is very little done to measure, a real measure, okay? But in my view, if behavior is conditional, so your preference for following a norm, okay, is conditional on your expectations, were expectation to change, you would stop following the norm. Now, obviously, there are differences among people. For example, think of a norm, a gender norm. Okay, my sensitivity to gender norms is very low. I don't care about gender norms that much. And therefore, you know, whenever I am in a situation where my expectation about people's behavior are very different from what they are now, let's say, I would very easily switch behavior. There are people for whom that they approve of gender norms, okay? Their sensitivity is very, very high. For these people, okay, the threshold for change will be very high. So for me, it's very low. For me, it's enough that to see, okay, 20% of change, fine, I change. For somebody else, it may be 90% of people have to change for them to move away. And it's very difficult to predict because we don't know people's threshold. And it's basically the distribution of people's threshold that will determine how quickly a norm may, like a gender norm, which is very strong in a population, will erode. This is very, very important. But this happens. Think of gay marriage. Would have we predicted 10 years ago that there would be gay marriage, that this thing would be more or less accepted, the gay couple could adopt children or have children from surrogate mothers and so on and so forth? It would have been very difficult. So I think 10 or so years ago, we would have said that certain gender norms regarding gay people, etc., were totally stable and strong, but they are not that stable and strong.
The point is that even if I reject gender norms, which I do, I still fall under their influence. So it's not about whether I endorse certain laws or if I reject them, but the fact that there is certain kind of normativity that pulls you under its skirt, even when you absolutely vehemently 100% reject that there's anything about this norm that is worth observing.
Yes, but the problem is because basically you feel that not enough people have rejected the norm, rejected you, or would reject you actually if you change behavior. You know, you feel in a sense that there will be a negative sanction for you in openly rejecting certain rules, okay? So your threshold, it may be low, but not that low, actually. This is a problem, okay?
Yeah, hi. I would like to try to raise an objection. Yes. So the economic model of human behavior is often accused of not having a sense for normative attitudes, right? It's all the other guys are basically restrictions on my action. The only thing that normatively binds me are my goals. Right, and other people are basically, you know, circumstances towards which I have to have, in order to be rational, cognitive attitudes. You call them empirical expectations. Now, you introduce normative expectations, and at the end, you said in the discussion, well, the way to foster norms is to raise normative expectations in a population. Now, my worry is, and you say so empirical expectations are basically predictions.
Yes.
Normative expectation, you say, are beliefs concerning other people's normative judgments.
Yes.
Now, one worry. This is not even a future-directed attitude. So you call it expectation. Expectations are usually, under normal circumstances, future-directed attitudes. Now, what you're saying is a normative expectation, is a present-directed attitudes. And my fear is it doesn't pull any water if the fact that something is that people perceive something as normatively binding explains why they do it. So for that, you still have no sense whatever, because it could be the case that everybody thinks, well, it would be nice if it were that way, so I have the normative judgment, but I do not assume that anybody is going to act that way. So the core element that, you know, sometimes you don't have to punish or manipulate information or doing anything like that. You just have to bring a value to the fore, because people have normative attitudes. They actually sometimes act because they perceive this as the right thing to do. That would be a normative attitude, not a belief about what other people's normative judgment.
But that's a very important distinction. You know, I make this distinction, and it is obviously questionable. I mean, if people ask me what's the difference between what I call moral behavior and following a social norm, and I think there is a certain unconditionality in moral behavior that you mentioned. You know, I think is the right thing. I don't care what other people do or don't do. You know, I will do it anyway. This is what I call moral behavior. I will not harm an innocent person. Sorry. You tell me lots of people do it, fine, let them do it. I don't, okay? And I will never do it. And this is a moral attitude, moral behavior. Social norms are different because there is a conditionality. So I will behave in a certain way provided I have certain beliefs about what other people do and about what other people approve or disapprove of. This, to me, is the essence of a social norm. Social norm and moral norms are two different animals. And when I did experiments, I did my first experiment to see if my theory, you know, holds water, basically. And what I see is that there is like a normal distribution. I did experiment of fairness, and there are two tails. The really bad guys, that doesn't matter, they behave badly. They are unfair, they don't care. And a minority of really good guys, that even if they can cheat, they will be nice. But these are minorities, tiny minorities. The large majority of people act conditionally, okay? Conditionally on what others do, conditionally if they can be observed or not, and so on and so forth. So the majority of people, in my view, are social norm followers. There is conditionality there. This is very important, conditionality versus unconditional behavior. And there is such thing, you know, as in principle unconditional behavior. There is, you quoted it. This is not a social norm, in my view. You know, you might say your theory is completely crazy. Fine. This is my theory.
Okay, I didn't get to announce the last question. There are no more questions, and time's up. Thank you very much for the engaging discussion and the talk.